There is a stretch of Colombian jungle, roughly 200 kilometers of it, where no road has ever been built, no village has ever been established, no communication tower has ever been erected, no government outpost, no missionary station, no logging camp, no mining survey marker, nothing that official Colombia has ever placed there with intention and left standing. Satellite imagery of this region shows an unbroken canopy of green, so dense and so uniform that it looks, from space, like the Earth simply decided to skip that part of the map and fill it with a single, uninterrupted texture. Fly over it in a small plane and you get the same thing. Green, then more green after that, rolling and folding over the ridgelines and down into the valleys and back up again, unbroken for as long as you can see in any direction, until the haze takes it. And yet, someone is in there. Not metaphorically, not historically, not in the sense that people once lived there and left traces. Right now, at this moment, while you are watching this. And there are people inside that green, living in ways that predate everything we call civilization by a margin that is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind, in a forest that has swallowed every attempt to reach them and spat back every person who has tried to make contact, in a silence so complete and so deliberately maintained that it has become, over the last several decades, one of the most closely watched silences on the planet. This is the story of that silence. What created it? What it contains, what it costs, and what it means that a group of human beings in the 21st century has chosen, with complete intention and absolute consistency, to remain unknown to the world that surrounds them. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the Earth the way it actually is. Not the cleaned-up version, not the version with the rough edges smoothed off, but the real thing, the part that still surprises you, the part that still has secrets. Let's go. The region we are talking about sits in the department of Amazonas, in the far south of Colombia, bleeding into the borders with Brazil and Peru, in the triangle of territory where the three countries meet. It is part of the larger Amazon basin, the single largest tropical rainforest on the planet, a system of waterways and canopy and undergrowth and life so complex and so interconnected that ecologists spend entire careers studying single square kilometers of it and still feel they have only begun. But this particular stretch, this 200-kilometer corridor of absolute human absence from any official record, is not simply jungle. It is a specific kind of place within the jungle. It is a place that has been made absent. There is a difference between a place where no one lives and a place where no one from outside is allowed to know anyone lives. The first kind of place is just geography. The second kind of place is a statement. And what we are looking at in this corner of Amazonian Colombia is a statement. One of the most radical and the most uncompromising statements a human community can make to the civilization pressing in on all sides of it. We know you are there, and we are choosing not to know you. The people who live in this region are, according to everything that Colombia's Indigenous Affairs bodies and FUNAI, Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Agency across the border, and the various anthropological organizations that have spent decades trying to understand this part of the Amazon, members of groups that have had what researchers call no peaceful contact with outside society. Some of these groups have had contact of the violent variety, the kind that was forced on them over 500 years of colonization and extraction and massacre, and have survived it and pulled back. Others, and this is the part that makes this corner of the Amazon so unusual, even in the context of the Amazon as a whole, appear to have been here so long and so deeply that there is no reliable historical record of any outside contact at all. They are not post-contact groups who retreated. They may never have been reached in the first place. To understand how that is possible in the 21st century, you need to understand what this forest actually is, as a physical environment. Because most people, when they imagine a jungle, imagine something manageable, something you push through with a machete, something with a ground level you can walk across, given sufficient effort and sufficient equipment. The Amazon is not that. Or rather, the Amazon in the places that are accessible from river systems and have been logged or farmed or settled is not that difficult in that particular way. But the deep Amazon, the interior Amazon, the Amazon that has never been accessible from any navigable river and has never been opened by any extractive industry, is something else. The forest floor in primary Amazonian rainforest receives somewhere between 1% and 2% of the sunlight that falls on the canopy above it. Think about that number. Think about what a forest must be to filter out 98% of the available light before it reaches the ground. The canopy is not a single layer, but a series of layers. Emergent trees rising above the main canopy itself, an understory of shade-tolerant trees below that, and below that the shrub layer and the ground cover, each layer intercepting light and converting it to leaf and wood and root, each layer making the next layer below it darker and more filtered and more difficult. Walking through primary Amazonian forest is not like walking through a park or even through a temperate forest. It is like walking through a series of green rooms, each one dim and humid and full of a biological complexity that is almost aggressive in its density. Every surface grows something, every fallen trunk is a habitat. Every pool of standing water is an ecosystem. The air itself is so saturated with moisture and organic molecules that it has a physical weight, a smell that is simultaneously the smell of growth and the smell of decay. Because in the Amazon, these two processes are not opposites, but the same process seen from different angles. In this environment, the idea of navigation, as most people understand it, landmark-based, horizon-oriented, dependent on being able to see more than a few meters in any direction, becomes meaningless. You cannot see the horizon. You cannot see the sky except as fragments of light filtering through the layers above. The sun tells you almost nothing about direction because by the time the light reaches you, it has been diffused and scattered by so many layers of leaf that it has no angle left. People who have been lost in primary Amazonian forest have described it as a kind of omnidirectional green, a space where every direction looks identical to every other direction, and where the normal spatial instincts that guide human movement through landscape simply fail to provide useful information. Search and rescue operations in the Amazon report that people who become lost in primary forest often move in tight circles without realizing it. Because the feedback loops that would normally tell you that you are turning, the visual cues of changing landscape, are absent. The people who live in this 200-kilometer stretch of that forest are not lost in it. They are home in it. That distinction is everything. They know this forest the way you know your own house at night, without having to see it. They know the specific trees that mark the boundaries of territories they have defended for generations. They know the waterways, not from maps but from memory, and from the accumulated knowledge of parents and grandparents who walked these same waterways and filed the information in the oral library that a people without writing must carry entirely in living minds. They know which plants are food and which are medicine and which are poison, and in the Amazon these categories are not always mutually exclusive, because the same plant that is lethal in one preparation is therapeutic in another, and the knowledge of how to make those distinctions is the kind of knowledge that takes lifetimes to build. They know where the animals are, not as a generalizing fact, but as a specific, daily, season-by-season knowledge of movement and behavior and sign that allows a hunter to find food in a forest that looks, to an outsider, utterly empty. The outside world learned, with certainty, that people were living in this region through a combination of satellite imagery and aerial observation that began to accumulate in the 1990s and has continued to build since. The images showed cleared patches in the forest, small garden plots of the kind that Amazonian indigenous groups have been maintaining for thousands of years, growing manioc and plantains and other crops in the partial clearings that forest gardening requires. The images showed structures, communal longhouses of the type common to many Amazonian peoples, thatched and open-sided and oriented in specific ways relative to the sun and the prevailing winds that indicated deliberate architectural planning rather than improvised shelter. The images showed, in some sequences, smoke from fires, and in the most striking cases, the images showed the fires going out, showed the clearings going cold, showed a human community that was aware it was being observed, and knew, from experience, what observation by outsiders preceded. This is the crucial thing about the people in that forest. They are not isolated because they are unaware of the world outside. They are isolated because they know enough about it to want nothing to do with it. The distinction between ignorance and refusal is the difference between a mystery and a choice. And it is a choice that has been made in the full awareness of what it costs. Because the jungle that protects these groups is not a static environment. It is being consumed. It is being eaten from the edges by forces that do not recognize the distinction between a forest where no one from outside lives and a forest where people who have chosen to avoid outside contact have lived for millennia. The coca cultivation networks that have used the deep jungle as cover for decades. The illegal gold mining operations that are currently destroying hundreds of thousands of acres of Amazonian forest in this precise border region of Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, poisoning the river systems with mercury as they go, driving further and further into territory that was previously inaccessible. The cattle ranchers pushing from the south, the timber operations, the narco-trafficking corridors that treat the unmapped jungle as infrastructure, as a natural wall behind which things can happen that the state cannot see. All of these forces are moving toward those 200 kilometers. Some of them are already at its edges, and the evidence that this is happening is visible not just in the satellite imagery of the forest cover, but in something else, in the behavior of the people inside it. There have been sightings. There have been a small number of encounters, brief, tense, and in some cases violent, between the isolated groups and outsiders who have penetrated the edge territories. Not government officials, who operate under strict protocols in this region and are legally prohibited from making unsolicited contact, but illegal miners, coca growers, lost hunters from settled indigenous communities further down the river systems. These encounters have a consistent shape. The outsider encounters signs of recent habitation, a cleared garden, a cold fire, structures visible through the trees. The outsider moves closer, and then, very quickly, either nothing happens because whoever was there has simply vanished back into the forest, or something happens that makes the nature of the refusal extremely clear. The arrows that are associated with this region are not warning shots. They are statements. They are the equivalent of a locked door. They are the physical expression of a policy that has been maintained with extraordinary consistency across generations. Brazilian anthropologists working in the analogous territory across the border, where FUNAI has been monitoring uncontacted groups since the 1980s, have documented a pattern of behavior that applies equally to the Colombian side. The groups are not passive. They are not simply hiding. They actively monitor the boundaries of their territory. They observe, with what appears to be sophisticated surveillance knowledge, the movement of outsiders. They communicate over distances within their own community, using methods that remain, to outside observers, invisible or inaudible. They relocate their settlements when they assess that a location has been compromised. They maintain what are essentially territorial checkpoints, marked in ways that outside observers have only learned to recognize through long study, that serve as both warning systems and boundary markers. This is not the behavior of a people in hiding. It is the behavior of a people with a defense strategy, and the defense strategy works. To the degree that the area has no roads, no villages visible from ground level, no communications infrastructure, and no record of any sustained outside presence. In a world where almost every piece of geography has been mapped, named, administered, and in some way integrated into the economic and political systems of nation-states, this is genuinely extraordinary. This is a place that has remained, by the active choice of its inhabitants, outside of everything. Now here is where the story gets more complicated, and more important, and more disturbing. Because the 200-kilometer reality is not simply a beautiful anomaly of human diversity, a touching reminder that not all people want what modernity offers. It is also a vulnerability, an enormous, growing, terrifying vulnerability. And understanding that vulnerability requires understanding some history that goes back much further than the satellite images. When Europeans first arrived in the Amazon basin in the 16th century, the forest was not a wilderness in the sense that word usually implies. It was inhabited. Deeply, extensively, complexly inhabited. Estimates of the pre-Columbian population of the Amazon vary widely, but the most recent and most credible research, incorporating advances in remote sensing and archaeological analysis of the terra preta soils that indicate long-term human habitation across vast areas of the basin, suggests that the Amazon at the time of first European contact may have had a population of anywhere from 8 to 10 million people. Some researchers push that number significantly higher. These were not isolated, scattered hunter-gatherers eking out a marginal existence in a difficult environment, though some groups certainly fit that description. Many of them were sophisticated agricultural and horticultural societies with complex political structures, dense settlements, extensive trade networks, and a relationship with the forest so long established and so carefully managed that the forest itself bears their fingerprints. The abundance of certain useful species in what looks like wild forest, the cashews and Brazil nuts and cacao and peach palms that seem to cluster in particular areas, is now understood by ecologists not as a coincidence of natural distribution, but as the legacy of deliberate human cultivation practiced over thousands of years. The Amazon that first European explorers described as a wilderness was in many places a garden, tended by peoples whose horticultural knowledge was so thoroughly integrated into the forest that it looked natural to outsiders who did not know what they were looking at. Then came the contact, and the contact in the Amazon as elsewhere in the Americas was a catastrophe so total and so swift that its scale remains difficult to fully comprehend, even with the benefit of 500 years of hindsight. The diseases that European contact introduced to the Americas, smallpox and measles and influenza and a dozen others, moved through populations that had zero immunological experience of them, with a speed and a lethality that modern epidemiologists describe as among the fastest demographic collapses in recorded human history. Estimates of the mortality rate from first epidemic contact range from 50 to 90% across different regions and different disease events. That means that for every 10 people who were alive in the Amazon before sustained European contact, between 5 and 9 of them were dead within a few generations of it. The societies that survived that collapse were not intact societies that had lost members. They were fundamentally transformed societies, communities in which the elders who carried the accumulated knowledge had died, in which the social structures that organized the transmission of knowledge had been disrupted or destroyed, in which the sheer weight of loss had changed everything about how the survivors understood themselves and their world. And many of those surviving groups, scattered and reduced and operating in the fragments of what had been complex social networks, pulled back into the deep forest, into the headwaters of the unmapped rivers, into the places that the newcomers, who moved along the major waterways and needed open land for the cattle and crops they were importing, had not yet reached and might not reach for a long time. The groups that are now in that 200-kilometer corridor in Colombian Amazonia are in all probability the descendants of that retreat. They may carry in their oral histories, in the stories their grandparents told their grandparents told their grandparents, the memory of what happened when the outside world came in. They may carry it not as abstract historical knowledge, but as a foundational explanation for why the policy of non-contact was adopted and why it must be maintained. The choice to stay invisible is rooted in an experience of what visibility cost. And the epidemiological dimension of this is not historical, it is current. It is one of the primary reasons that the Colombian and Brazilian governments and the international organizations that advise them on indigenous rights have adopted policies of non-contact with these groups as the official position. The people in that forest have been isolated from the outside world for generations, possibly for centuries. Their immune systems have had no exposure to the common pathogens that circulate in the outside world. Influenza, which most adults in industrialized countries experience as a week of misery and then recover from, could move through an isolated community with no prior exposure, with a lethality similar to what happened in the 16th century. A simple respiratory virus that an illegal miner brings into the territory without even knowing he is carrying it could kill half the community he encounters before anyone realizes what is happening. This is not a theoretical risk. It has happened, repeatedly, in documented cases across the Amazon basin over the past 50 years. Groups that had contact forced upon them by miners or missionaries or land grabbers have suffered epidemic mortality that mirrors, at a smaller and more localized scale, the catastrophes of the colonial period. The pattern is known, the mechanism is understood. The only reliable protection is the one the groups themselves have chosen: distance. So the 200-kilometer silence is not just a cultural choice, it is a medical necessity. And the threats closing in on that silence from outside are therefore not just threats to a way of life. They are threats to survival itself, to the literal physical survival of populations that have no immune defense against the world pressing in on them. Let us go deeper into what we actually know about how people live in that forest, because this is where the story becomes not just important, but genuinely astonishing. The things that people can do in an environment they have inhabited for long enough is one of the most extraordinary dimensions of human existence, and the isolated Amazonian groups represent an extreme case of that principle that is worth sitting with for a moment. The primary ecological system that sustains life in the deep Amazon is not, as many people assume, hunting. The large game that most people associate with Amazonian forests, the tapirs and the large peccaries and the giant anteaters, are present, but not abundant, and hunting them requires enormous effort relative to the caloric return in dense primary forest. The primary subsistence base for virtually all Amazonian indigenous groups, including those that have had no contact, is horticulture, the management of forest gardens, Cleared patches of a size that the forest will not immediately reclaim, where manioc and other root crops and plantains and various fruit trees are cultivated, combined with the gathering of wild foods and with fishing in the waterways. Manioc is worth understanding specifically because it is the foundation of Amazonian subsistence in a way that has no real parallel outside the tropics. The domesticated manioc plant, which was developed from its wild relatives by Amazonian peoples over thousands of years through the kind of deliberate selective breeding that has also given us maize and wheat and rice and every other major crop, is one of the most calorie-productive plants on Earth per unit of agricultural labor. It grows in poor soils that will not support other crops. It is resistant to drought in ways that make it reliable even when rainfall is irregular. It stores in the ground after maturity, meaning it can be harvested on demand over a period of months, rather than requiring immediate processing and preservation at a single harvest moment. And in its bitter varieties, the varieties that contain cyanogenic compounds that are toxic if eaten raw, the knowledge of how to process it, how to squeeze out the toxic juice using the basketry press called the tapiti, how to dry and bake the resulting flour into the flatbreads that are the daily staple, represents exactly the kind of accumulated technical knowledge that looks simple from the outside, but represents thousands of years of experimental refinement. The garden system is not a fixed location system. It is rotational. A clearing is made, cultivated for a few years, then allowed to begin returning to forest, while a new clearing is made elsewhere. The abandoned gardens become secondary growth, that is, paradoxically, some of the most productive habitat in the Amazon for hunting, because the disturbed ground and the regrowing vegetation attract deer and peccaries and the birds that a hunter can take. The forest garden secondary growth cycle is a managed landscape, one that produces food and habitat across a territory that, to an outside observer flying over it, looks like unbroken primary forest, because the scale of the clearings relative to the scale of the forest makes them invisible unless you are specifically looking for them and know what you are looking for. This management operates across a territorial range, not a fixed location but a circuit of seasonal movements, following the availability of resources as they shift through the year. The fish runs in the dry season, when water levels drop and fish concentrate in the shrinking rivers. The fruiting of certain trees at certain times of year, the arrival of the migratory birds, the drying season for making the ceramic vessels that store and transport water and food. All of this is orchestrated according to a calendar. Not a written calendar, but an oral and observational calendar carried in the knowledge of the community, in the individual and collective memory of where to be and when to be there, that allows a group of people to live comfortably in an environment that would kill most outsiders within days. The medicine embedded in this knowledge deserves specific attention. The Amazon contains, within its biological diversity, an extraordinary pharmacopoeia, a living library of compounds that affect human biochemistry in ways that range from the mundane to the profound. The development of modern pharmaceutical compounds derived from Amazonian plant knowledge, from the curare compounds used in surgical anesthesia, to the compounds being investigated for treatments of everything from cancer to neurological disorders, represents only a tiny fraction of the chemical diversity that Amazonian peoples have been studying, empirically and systematically, for thousands of years. The plant knowledge of an isolated Amazonian community is not folk medicine in the dismissive sense that phrase sometimes carries. It is a pharmacological science, developed over a time frame and with a methodology of trial and observation that is in some ways more rigorous than it sounds, because the consequences of getting it wrong in a context with no emergency medicine backup are severe enough to have enforced a careful empiricism over generations. We are talking about people who can treat infections with forest compounds that have antibacterial properties, who can manage pain and fever with plant preparations, who understand the properties of the psychoactive plants of the Amazon, the ayahuasca vine, and the various admixture plants, not in the context of recreational use, but in the context of specific ceremonial and diagnostic functions that integrate plant chemistry with the community's understanding of the relationship between physical and psychological health. Who can set broken bones? Who know which snake bite requires which treatment? And where to find the specific plant that provides it? Who can manage childbirth safely in a forest environment with no instruments and no sterile field in any conventional sense? All of this without the infrastructure of trained specialists and hospitals and pharmaceutical supply chains that the outside world considers the minimum necessary for human health. The loss of this knowledge, if these communities are destroyed or disrupted before it can be documented or transmitted, is not just a human tragedy in the individual sense. It is an intellectual catastrophe on a civilizational scale. We are losing libraries, not metaphorical libraries, actual repositories of information about the living world that took thousands of years to compile and that cannot be reconstructed once they are gone. Because the reconstruction requires not just the plants and the chemicals, but the lived context of experience and relationship with this specific place that only comes from having been here for long enough. Now let me take you to the political reality, because this story has one, and it is impossible to tell the full truth of what is happening in that 200-kilometer corridor without it. Colombia has, on paper, one of the strongest legal frameworks for indigenous rights in Latin America. The 1991 Constitution established indigenous territories as collective property, inalienable and not transferable, and recognized indigenous communities as having the right to govern themselves according to their own customs and laws within those territories. The constitutional framework that emerged from that document created resguardos, legally recognized indigenous territories, that cover a significant fraction of Colombian national territory. In the Amazon region, these resguardos are vast, covering millions of hectares of forest that are legally designated as indigenous lands, with restrictions on extractive industries and outside settlement. The territory in which the isolated groups live is, in principle, covered by these protections. There are resguardos that overlap with or border the area. There are protections on paper, but the paper protections and the reality on the ground are separated by a distance that is difficult to overstate. The Colombian state's ability to enforce its laws in the deep Amazon has always been limited, and in the years of ongoing conflict between the government and guerrilla organizations and paramilitary groups and narco-trafficking networks, that capacity has been stretched and in many areas effectively absent. The FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, maintained effective control over large areas of the Colombian Amazon for decades, and their withdrawal following the 2016 peace agreement created a vacuum that has been filled, in many cases, by other armed groups and by the acceleration of illegal extractive activities that the FARC had in some areas, paradoxically, limited in order to maintain their own territorial control. The illegal gold mining that is currently devastating the Colombian Amazon, particularly in the departments of Amazonas, Valpais, and the border regions with Brazil and Venezuela, is not a small-scale artisanal activity. It is an industrial operation backed by criminal networks, using heavy dredging equipment that is floated into remote river locations on barges, operated by hundreds of workers brought in from outside, and generating hundreds of millions of dollars per year in gold that moves through networks of money laundering into the legitimate financial system. The mercury that this operation releases into the river systems, used in the amalgamation process that separates gold from river sediment, is poisoning the aquatic food chains of the Amazon at a rate that researchers describe as comparable to industrial chemical disasters in developed countries, except it is happening in a place with no regulatory response and no media attention and no political will to stop it. And it is moving toward those 200 kilometers. It does not move slowly. In the Brazilian Amazon across the border, protected territories that were considered effectively inaccessible as recently as a decade ago have been penetrated by illegal mining operations that cut airstrips in the forest, fly in equipment, and begin operations before any official response can be organized. The Yanomami territory in Brazil, one of the most protected indigenous areas in South America, suffered a catastrophic invasion by illegal gold miners called garimpos in recent years, with an estimated 20,000 miners operating inside the territory at the peak of the invasion, bringing with them malaria and respiratory diseases and the social disruption that accompanies any sudden influx of outside population into a community with no capacity to absorb it. The results were exactly what the experts predicted, and exactly what the historical pattern would lead anyone to expect. Children died from malnutrition and disease at rates that prompted emergency declarations. Communities were displaced from their river territories by the mining operations. The mercury contaminated the fish that were the primary protein source for river communities, creating a slow poisoning that compounds the acute health crisis. What happened to the Yanomami in Brazil is not a warning for what might happen in the Colombian Amazon. It is a preview. The dynamics are identical. The actors are the same networks. The forests are the same forest. The only difference is timing. And yet the groups in the 200-kilometer corridor are not passive in the face of this. They have been described, by the various Colombian and international researchers who monitor the area from safe distances as remarkably adaptive in their responses to the encroaching pressure. There is evidence in the satellite imagery of changes in settlement patterns over the past 2 decades, movements deeper into the territory, away from the waterways that have historically been the routes of outside penetration. There is evidence of the abandonment and sometimes deliberate destruction of structures in locations that may have been compromised. There is evidence in the changed frequency of sighting reports from the outer edges of the territory of reduced edge presence, suggesting a deliberate withdrawal toward the interior. They are not waiting to be found. They are moving away from being found, which requires, at minimum, that they have some awareness of the direction from which the threat is approaching, which in turn requires a surveillance capability across the outer boundaries of their territory that is, by any measure, sophisticated. How does a community with no modern technology monitor the boundaries of a territory that extends for dozens of kilometers in every direction through primary forest? The answer, presumably, is the same way that they do everything else, with knowledge that has been accumulated over generations of living in this specific place. They know the sounds of this forest. They know when something does not belong. They know the difference between the movement of a tapir through the undergrowth and the movement of a human being trying to be quiet. They know the difference between a fire that is a natural lightning strike and a fire that is a cooking fire. They know their forest well enough that anything foreign in it registers as foreign immediately. This is the other thing about people who have been somewhere long enough. They own the frequency of the place. They are tuned to it in a way that no newcomer, however well equipped, can replicate. The deep Amazon is not simply a physical environment that can be overcome with the right gear. It is a knowledge environment, and the knowledge required to navigate it successfully belongs, in its fullest form, only to the people who have been building it for the longest time. There is a concept in anthropology that is particularly relevant here, a concept called the long now of indigenous existence. Most of the historical periods we talk about in global history are short. The Roman Empire, the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century. These are slivers. They are thin films of time laid over a geological and biological and human deep time that makes them look, when you zoom out far enough, like barely distinguishable moments. The communities that have been living in the Amazon for the longest documented periods have been there for somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, and possibly before it. 10,000 years is roughly 500 generations of human beings, each one living and dying and transmitting what they learned to the next. The accumulated knowledge of 500 generations of careful observation of the same ecosystem is a library of a size and a specificity that is simply incomparable to anything that any other system of knowledge accumulation has produced about that ecosystem. We, the outside world, have been studying the Amazon with scientific instruments and published research for maybe 200 years. The people in that forest have been running empirical experiments on it for 10,000. The question of who knows it better is not a close call. Let me tell you about a specific set of encounters that gives some texture to what contact with these groups, in the few documented cases where it has occurred at its most controlled, actually looks like. In the neighboring region of the Colombian Valpes, there have been interactions over the decades between government officials operating under strict non-contact protocols and groups that have occasionally approached the boundary of their territories in ways that suggested, if not a desire for full contact, at least a willingness to observe and assess. These interactions, described by the officials involved with a care and a detail that reflects how significant they understood them to be, have a consistent quality of mutual observation. Two kinds of humans, both fully human, both fully aware of the humanity of the other, looking at each other from a distance that preserves the ambiguity that both sides appear to need. In one case, a team of Colombian indigenous affairs officials traveling by small boat up a tributary river in the Valpes region encountered, on a riverbank, a group of individuals who stood and watched the boat pass, without retreating and without making any hostile gesture. The officials, following protocol, maintained their distance, did not approach the bank, spoke in a normal conversational tone, rather than making any approach or appeal. The individuals on the bank watched until the boat passed and then disappeared back into the forest. No arrows, no aggression, no communication of any kind that anyone in the boat could interpret, but presence, acknowledgement, the choice to be seen without being approached, which is itself a kind of communication if you are willing to read it carefully. What does it mean for a community to choose to be seen at a specific moment and specific distance? What does the calculation look like from inside a community that has maintained non-contact for generations when a boat appears on the river? There must be a decision. There must be a protocol. Not every individual in the group makes that decision independently in the moment. There is a community understanding of what the response to an outside presence should be, and that understanding is the product of collective history and collective deliberation and collective wisdom about what the costs and risks of different responses have been. The fact that the response in this case was presence without approach rather than flight or aggression suggests a degree of nuanced assessment of the threat level that goes well beyond simple fear response. They evaluated the boat, they evaluated the people in it, they made a judgment, they stood. The people making decisions about how to respond to outside contact in communities like this are not acting from ignorance or from primitive reflex. They are acting from political intelligence that has been developed in the context of a specific and well-documented history of what happened when contact was accepted. They know, in whatever form that knowledge takes in an oral tradition, that contact preceded catastrophe. They are managing that knowledge the way any sophisticated political community manages its historical knowledge, as the foundation of current policy. The international legal framework around isolated indigenous groups has developed significantly in the last 3 decades, largely in response to what happened in cases where isolation was disrupted, either deliberately or accidentally. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007 after more than 2 decades of negotiation, includes provisions for the rights of isolated peoples that go beyond general indigenous rights protections to address the specific vulnerability of groups with no contact with national society. The principle of no unsolicited contact, the principle that the choice of whether to engage with the outside world belongs to the isolated group and not to any outside actor, is now the stated position of the Colombian and Brazilian governments and of the major international indigenous rights organizations. But principles and reality have a complicated relationship in a region where the state's physical presence is negligible and the economic incentives for violating those principles are enormous. The gold in the rivers of the Colombian and Brazilian Amazon is not a small amount of gold. It is billions of dollars in gold, lying in the sediments of rivers that the national governments have neither the capacity nor, in some cases, the genuine will to protect. The coca that grows in the shade of the jungle is not a small cocaine market. It is the foundation of a global narcotics supply chain that generates revenues that dwarf the annual budgets of the regional governments responsible for protecting the territories it grows in. Against these incentives, the protection of a few thousand people who cannot vote, cannot organize politically, cannot appear in any court, and cannot speak to any media because they have no contact with any of those systems is not a priority that survives contact with economic and political reality without sustained, active, international attention. This is why the groups in the 200-kilometer corridor matter beyond their own immediate survival. They are, in a very real sense, a test case for whether the legal and moral commitments of the international community mean anything when they are not convenient, when they cost something real, when honoring them requires the kind of sustained, unglamorous, expensive enforcement that generates no political reward for the politicians who fund it, and no media interest for the audiences that might pressure those politicians. The story of the isolated groups in the Colombian Amazon is a story about whether the world will act on its stated values when acting on them is inconvenient. So far, the record is mixed. The Colombian government's track record on indigenous rights enforcement in the Amazon has improved somewhat in specific areas while deteriorating in others, shaped by changes in political administration and by the impossible operational challenge of governing a territory the size of France with the resources available. The international indigenous rights organizations work with limited budgets and limited access. The researchers who have dedicated their careers to monitoring this situation do so with a combination of satellite tools and ground-level contacts in settled indigenous communities near the isolated territories, piecing together a picture from fragments that is always incomplete. What they know, as of the most recent assessments, is that the territory is still intact, that the groups are still there, that they are still maintaining their policy of non-contact with a consistency that has not broken in any documented case, that the threats from outside are real and growing, but have not yet breached the interior, and that the forest itself, dense and difficult and unforgiving of the unprepared, is still doing what it has always done for the people inside it, keeping the outside out. There is a deeper question underneath all of this, a philosophical question that the existence of these groups forces onto the table in a way that cannot be easily avoided. What does it mean, in the 21st century, to choose to be outside? Not outside as in disconnected from the internet, not outside as in off-grid in the way that word is used by people who grow their own vegetables and have solar panels, but outside in the full sense. Outside of national citizenship, outside of the global economy, outside of the recorded human story, in any form that the outside world has access to. What kind of life is being lived in that 200-kilometer forest, and how should we understand it? The temptation, from the outside, is to understand it in one of two ways, both of which are inadequate. The first is the romantic understanding. These people are living in a pure, uncorrupted state of nature, free from the alienations of modern life, in harmony with the forest in ways that civilization has destroyed. This understanding is inadequate because it is not true, or rather because it is true only in the most superficial sense and misleading in the more important sense. Life in the deep Amazon is not idyllic in any simple way. It is hard. It is physically demanding in ways that modern sedentary life is not. It involves real suffering from injury,